Thanks so much, guys, for joining us. So today, our talk is about a Sitecore Architect in the Composable DXP world. So we'll walk through if your role has changed and if it's changed, what you need to do. My name is Akshay Sura. Been an MVP for a long time. I try to help in the community, and my main job is I want to make friends. So why can't you be my friend is what I always ask people. And with me here is...
And I'm Kamruz Jaman. I'm also known as the British Cam, or now that Cam Figgy has left the Sitecore world, I'll claim to be the real Cam, the only Cam. I'm a Sitecore MVP for the past 10 years, and yeah, hopefully you guys have seen me around from the community. So we want to talk to you about, before we get into how the roles have changed, let's talk about what is Composable DXP. For the past few years, there's obviously been huge amounts of change in all of our personal lives with the pandemic, but there's also been big changes within the Sitecore world itself. Sitecore itself has been buying up, not so quietly, buying up a whole bunch of headless, composable cloud SaaS companies, Musa and Order Cloud, to name a couple of them. And so with that, of course, Sitecore, previous to that, Sitecore had also released JSS, which was a headless offering. But there's been, just within our space, there's been a big change in the last 2 years compared to the last like 12 or 14 years even. So what is composable? What is a monolith? So a monolith is where you have your traditional systems where everything is built on one platform. So all of your content, the presentation, the analytics, the e-commerce, all the experience that goes with it, all sits within one platform. Then you build your code using their SDKs, and you deploy that into the same instance, and then you deploy it out. So everything is just all in one. The composable approach is you have one product for each specific task. So you have a solution for the content, you'll have a different solution for the commerce, you'll have a different solution for the personalization, you have a different solution for the analytics and the experience. And then you need to bring all of those together and compose it essentially, right? So that's hence the term Composable DXP, Digital Experience Platform. It's it is becoming more and more prevalent. Using the composable approach, it gives you a lot of freedom. By transitioning to the composable approach, you get to pick and choose the exact parts of the system that you need for that particular solution. And more, it's becoming the analyst's go-to approach for solutions. Gartner even says use Composable DXP in order to future-proof your tech stack, because it's so easy to, pull in and out the different parts. It gives you the best way of being future-proof to the changing business needs.
Yeah, so like one of the biggest things about adopting composable is doesn't mean you throw everything out and get everything new. It just means that you find what works for your team the best. If it means reusing what you already have, great. If you for analytics or for personalization, any of the pieces that you are not happy with what you currently have, you can definitely go find the best of breed. So best of breed doesn't necessarily mean the best in the industry based on reviews or usage or whatever. Best of breed really means what is best for your situation and for your project. And always remember, it's not all at once. So in the sense you don't completely get rid of your stack and create a brand new stack. You can do it in a very agile way so that these new systems are not, duplicating your efforts in terms of anything, right? So like storing assets in 5 different places or commerce or personalization, it needs to make your life easy, not difficult.
So let's move on to talk about what is Jamstack. Jamstack is quite synonymously used with Composable. They're not actually the same thing, but Jamstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And it's a modern pattern of architecture for web development. And it's based on client-side JavaScript, reusable APIs, and pre-built markup. So the markup being the HTML, usually static HTML. APIs being the endpoints that you call, which provide data and functionality, and then the JavaScript just to tie those two together. We've probably been doing something similar-ish to this approach for parts of our application. For example, if you have a search page, you probably would render out a very basic search page, and then you'd have an API endpoint to actually give you search results, and then you have some JavaScript to actually then render that onto the page. And then when you're going to the next set of results and you're paging through the results, you're just calling those API endpoints to get more results, and then just rendering it back up onto the HTML page. That's the basic concept, but with the markup in the Jamstack approach, you will usually try to pre-generate the markup, the HTML pages. There's a few ways of doing that. Either you statically generate the pages all up front, or you use something like Next.js, which has built-in features for what they call incremental static regeneration, which will essentially cache a page on request for a certain number of time.
So people talk about cost, and the good thing about all of the things that we're telling you today is all based on 2 years of hard proof. So in about 2018 or so, we kind of pivoted more towards Jamstack when Sitecore wasn't there yet. And what we've learned is when people, the standard reasons of why you should move to Jamstack, they show the same slide again and again. But in our mind, what we've learned is it does make a difference in cost. So cost to run, per month cost in terms of subscriptions, infrastructure, cost to build, so cost for developers, as well as in general, the cost to create and run these projects is a lot less than it is for a monolith. And that's something which we have witnessed at firsthand. The other things is, when we used to build websites using these monoliths, we used to run a lot of the security scans, performance testing. What we did learn after that is when we go to more of this composable DXP Jamstack methodology, we don't do that anymore. I don't keep an eye on how many builds are going through. The builds take about 1.5 to 3 minutes for us to push it to an environment. It's CDN'd by default, it's on the edge, it's secure by default, it's super scalable. So we are not really having to put that much time and effort into DevOps like we used to before, because we just forget it and it just does it. One of the other coolest things, which I think, I haven't used Docker in 2 years, thank God. But for us to set up a brand new developer takes minutes, not hours. So they just pull, there's node modules to deal with, but they just pull and then they just run it. And then they have the install running on their machine. They don't need special machines, powerful machines. So that's pretty cool. The API documentation is amazing. So all of these are API first by default. So what ends up happening is most of these places have really good API documentation. So when you need to look something up, like what do I need to do for this? It's super easy. It's there. You even get it in Google search. You don't really have to go to the vendor's website for it, but it's all there. So for me, from setup to run to deploy to build, it's super easy in my world.
Yeah, the documentation, I think, and the learning experience using these cloud-based systems and taking the Jamstack approach has been amazing, right? Even from when we learned, because we didn't, we had never touched these systems before, and The documentation is amazing. The setup is really, really good. Very simple step-by-step instructions. A lot of them will have free dev instances, so you can learn without requiring a specific vendor license. The online learning has been great, that a lot of them are free. They have good free documentation available, and you don't need to use .peak, right? So, and you can't use .peak because it's not a DLL. You're going up against a cloud-based system, so the only thing you heavily relied on the documentation for those APIs. So it was a bit of a breath of fresh air from our previous learning experience, for sure.
And one of the main things we want to drive home is one size does not fit all. What we mean by this is, I come up with it, I create a really great site, works really well, runs really well. That doesn't mean that's the same formula for another site or another customer. Every customer and every problem has a different way of managing it. So you go into a customer, you need to see what fits their need the best. So based on the problems they're having, you're trying to solve a problem. You're not trying to jam the technologies you need into the problem they are having. You try to look at their problems and then find what the solutions are based on their problems. So what I use on one project does not mean it's the same exact thing I'm hoping to use on the next. I'm hoping to on a different project to look at the issues they're having, find the solutions for them if they already exist or not. If they do, we use the existing ones. If not, we try to find a solution for the issue they're having and find the best fit for that project.
Yeah, and some of the products we're using, it took us a while to come up with that matrix, right? We've as Akshay mentioned, we've been looking at this space since 2018, and we came up with our own internal list of requirements of what we needed these products to be able to fulfill. And what we found was, obviously with the traditional monolith, so a lot of our customers were not using most of the capabilities. So what were the key areas that we needed to fit? What were the key features we needed that customers couldn't live without transition, especially during the transition period? We tried lots and lots of different products, went through a number of iterations. The market has matured a bit more, and there is a lot more information out on those. But yeah, don't be afraid to give a few things a try. And so one of the issues we found from our previous implementations was, a lot of our customers were not using all of the features of the Sitecore XP platform. Sitecore is very, very feature rich, and there's a lot of features in there, and if people use it properly, they can get very, very good results out of it. But it does take a lot of effort, right, to implement Sitecore well and implement it properly. And I think one of the issues is Sitecore is not a Sitecore-like solution. It's not a one and done type of situation. You have to keep. It's an ongoing process with personalization. You personalize, you follow up on the results, you then adjust, and then you personalize, you follow up on the results, and you adjust. So it has to be taken extremely seriously. It needs buy-in from the company, from the very top all the way down to the very bottom. And I think a lot of our customers just were not there, they just were not mature enough. And then, one of the statistics floating around is that like 80% of Sitecore sites are not using personalization, which is one of the main strengths of Sitecore. So at that point, if you're not using those features, you have all of this built into the platform, which adds a lot of complexity to both, the infrastructure and also the code, the learning that goes with it. If you're not using them, why bother having all of this there and just adding extra burden?
So what does it really mean to me being a Sitecore architect in a Composable DXP world? I think a lot of things are similar, just trying to look at things a little bit differently, right? So every time, in your projects, when you're looking for how to solve the problem, we try to look at it in terms of, what part of Sitecore would solve this problem, or how do I solve this problem? But we're kind of limited in terms of what we look into. In a composable world, you're looking at decoupled solutions. You're not looking for all-in-one. So if you're looking for a CRM or a contact-based thing in a composable world, you're looking at a system with all the features that you need in terms of it, and then going off and figuring out a technology solution which fits the problem. You're not coming into it with the technology in mind and then saying, oh, wait, it solves 5 of the problems, so I'm good with it, and then I'll figure out the rest of the 2. So it's challenging yourself to find the best solution and basically going out of your comfort zone, right? So it's not like, I think Kamruz has a few slides on this, where we are so focused on the ecosystem for the monolith that we tend to forget or not look outside to challenge ourselves to say, oh, there might be other technologies which can solve this relatively easily. So the Sitecore Architect in a composable world is essentially what we're doing right now, except you're challenging yourself to find something which can fit the needs much better, look at it from a very decoupled way where the system is not integrated as part of yours, API first approach, and so on. I think so. Challenge yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to look at what the role of an architect is. Wikipedia defines it as a software development expert who makes high-level choices and tries to enforce technical standards, including software coding standards, tools, and platforms. And I think in the Sitecore world, we, at least myself, I know it's the same for you as well, we've had this very kind of blurred line between what is an architect and what is a tech lead, senior developer, for example. So we tend to have been doing all-in-one, whereas in more traditional, stricter IT worlds, there's a good separation between that. We tended to end up writing a lot of code, but a lot of architects don't do that. I myself have been writing less and less code these days, and I think the makeup of the team has been changing. We've kind of been getting used to that a little bit with JSS, especially. You have a separate team for the front end builds, doing the React development. You have a separate team for the back end devs doing, writing your resolvers and that kind of thing. You'll have a few full stack developers thrown in there. And as an architect, I think we should be asking ourselves, should we be actively coding on the project, or should we be leaving that to our team members? Do I, as an architect, need to know 100% of all of the tech that we work with? Do I need to know React, Next.js, Gatsby, or can I just have an overall view of how these technologies work and have a rough understanding on how they fit together? There's a lot of new tech coming out all the time. It's one of the banes of the IT world, right? It's always changing, and it's extremely hard to keep up with it, even within the Sitecore space itself. I know I am much more heavily focused within the core Sitecore CMS platform, but then within that you have things like JSS, you have EXM, you have marketing automation, and you have all of those other systems which have been added on over time. It's even within the one system, it's hard to know everything. So we have tended to specialize within our little areas. And now obviously Sitecore's coming out with AutoCloud and Lucent and Personalize and Send, and so all of these things are, do you as an architect need to know all of these inside out, or is it better to hire the talent that you actually need? So the architect's role is blurred, and I think we should be on the lookout for the technology that best fits the needs rather than the technology that we personally know and are most comfortable with.
So then what we tried to do is we tried to look at some typical architecture diagrams for the monolith. So if you look at it, you have code in some repository, you have Azure DevOps, you have a deployment system. Code gets deployed to the environment. So depending on if you have the commerce or just the core CMS, all the standard roles we push to them, magic happens, and then you, from your CD servers, you have some kind of a CDN, which gives the site to the user. So this is pretty standard. You can put different icons for it, but it looks pretty standard, right? So then these are from different customers. So if you look at it, some customers have integrations into other systems, some customers don't, but pretty much when you look at the roles of where the things are, they all look same. So looking at it, so these are just based on the slides we showed before. There are some integrations. I'm sure I could fill 10 slides like this of all the integrations you guys have worked with when you're working on the Sitecore platform, right, of different systems we integrate into. So we are doing the work. We are putting the effort into integrating into SAP or Salesforce or Eloqua, different systems. So once we look at the same architecture diagrams now with all the different systems, so like I'm embedding forms, talking to Google Analytics, still doing the build and deploy, but I'm talking to Azure functions, doing a bunch of other things. If you go to the next slide, cameras. And then this is the second one now with the external services added to the right. So again, we're talking to SAP, Salesforce, Leadlift, and Widen Dam. And then the next one, cameras. And then in this case, we're doing even more. So now we're talking to Acton, SendGrid, Cloudinary, Epicor, Salsify. So in my mind, I'm going to ask cameras this is, hey, I'm already integrating with external services. They are API based. I am embedding forms. I'm talking to their API. So am I not already composable then?
Well, you're kind of composable, right? Because you have these external systems and these cloud-based systems that you're using. But then you've also got the traditional monolith on the backing it as well. So you've ended up on this hybrid kind of situation where you have some composable systems, but you still have the weight of the monolith and all of the costs and infrastructure and the development overhead that we talked about earlier. So you're not fully taking advantage of Composable DXP, which traditionally these systems are omni-channel. So you're not just talking about the web focus. Our traditional systems have been very web focused. You're talking omni-channel, so it could be mobile, web, your toaster, your fridge, whatever needs data content can pull it out. They're typically API. They take an API-based approach and are headless first. They follow a microservices-based approach. So each one does this one thing very, very well. And they are SaaS, by default. They're scaled. They're globally scaled, globally deployed. The updates are done automatically. You don't have to touch it to get any features and bug fixes. They're fully featured. They're fully managed services. So you just pay your monthly fee, and somebody looks after all of the infrastructure and everything else that goes with it. Some of the systems we've been using is just, you wake up one day and, hey, a bunch of bugs have been fixed and a bunch of new features have been added. So really, really nice not have to deal with any of that. They're typically, they're technology agnostic. I mentioned that they take an API-based approach. So they don't care what technology you use for your solution. It's just a REST-based API. So you've used that multiple times within your projects. It's the same approach. So it doesn't matter how you use it. They are typically best of breed systems. So each one does something very, very well. Find the systems that work best for you, for the functionality that you need. And if you need some more additional functionality in a few years' time, add that system. If a system doesn't work for you, it is obviously takes a little bit of work, but you can swap that one very specific system out and replace it with another one. Which means, of course, you avoid this vendor lock. I'm not beholden to my monolith, which provides me everything, and then, hey, they do something quite well, but not really well. So I have to stick with them because that's the overall system we have. You can avoid all of that, and equally getting data in and out of those systems is usually very simple. Again, these are API-based systems. They usually also have a management API available, which will allow you to push data in, and a delivery API, which will allow you to pull data out. And if you use GraphQL, of course, the data structures, it allows you to structure data responses how you need and how you want to use them. And if multiple systems support GraphQL, that makes it that much more easier to swap them out and replace them in the future. And avoiding vendor lock also means avoiding agency lock as well, because these are very open systems, just API-based systems, and the way that they work. Different platforms work relatively the same, so I don't now need a vendor which is just very specialized only in Sitecore, for example. So that keeps all parties quite honest, I think. Both the vendors, the agencies, as well as the customers. Everyone knows that you're not just working in this very small market. It opens up that competition, which is a good thing in my opinion. And one of the final advantages is the rapid response to business needs. Already mentioned that it's easy to swap systems in and out, but it's also very easy to add new systems in as the business needs change in the future. And you can add those systems at the point of needing them, and not having this monolith system with all of the features from way before, not using them, and then having to add all that overhead of managing it in the meantime. There are some disadvantages that go with it. So I mentioned earlier that it's omnichannel, but also the fact it is omnichannel means that it's not web specific. That was a big one of the big things that hit us when we first started working with this was it's not web specific. So you don't get the concepts of things like URLs and slugs or tree structures for paths. A lot of these will work as like buckets of items that you just throw things into, and then you use like the equivalent of facets or tagging to actually get the data that you want out for the specific things. There's ways of working around it, and different systems have allow you to view tree structures and things like that using plugins or inbuilt functionality. Again, just look at the different platforms and see what works for you, what you like and what you don't like. There is multiple systems and multiple vendors. It's a bit of there's a lot of different vendors out there, and that's one of the first things that's going to hit you is which system do I use? What's the best one? Which one's going to work? Yeah, there is a lot of choice, and you're going to end up going through a lot of demos and initially trying to keep up with all the different systems coming out. You will narrow it down. We went through the same thing. We have a handful of systems in each specific area that we work with a lot, and those are systems we typically tend to stick with. But if a customer has a different system that they specifically want to use, a lot of them are very similar. They're just API-based systems at that point, and we don't have to manage the infrastructure. It's just a SaaS system, so that makes it much easier in being able to support those and build on those systems. And none of these systems typically have any functionality out of the box, but we're kind of used to that with Sitecore anyway. Some of them will have like starter kits and sample sites that you can just clone a repo and get up and running with. I do wish that more of them took an SXA type of approach as well to give you a bit more functionality, but it should be interesting with Sitecore's upcoming approaches, what they do. They mentioned a number of things at SUGCon where they may have some theming available, templates and themes available for their headless systems coming out. So keep an eye out for that, along with the dashboards. These systems typically don't have any dashboards available. They're multiple separate disparate systems, which is a bit different from what we're used to with Sitecore, with the launchpad. You just go into the one system, and all of the functionalities off of that launchpad. Sitecore have their own version of this dashboard launchpad thing for their group of headless and composable systems. So that's just within the Sitecore ecosystem. So, you know, Content Hub, Cycle Send, Cycle Personalize, Order Cloud, for example. So it'd be interesting. So it'd be interesting to see what they're coming up with. Again, the lack of visual editors. A lot of headless vendors don't have a visual editor, kind of like the experience editor. And doesn't matter how painful the experience editor is, it actually does provide pretty good functionality. A lot of the vendors don't have those. A few vendors do. So, you know, if that's important to you, keep an eye out on those choices. And again, this is something that Sitecore will be tackling in its upcoming composable releases. They have something coming out called Symphony, which builds upon Sitecore Horizon, and it will allow you to edit content from multiple different headless vendors. So they had a slide up on Sitecore which showed data coming in from Contentful and Kentico provide content, as well as Content Hub, or their headless Content Hub offering that's going to be released soon.
So we took, these are like what do you call, like architecture diagrams to what we had shown before. And if you look at it, this looks a little bit different in a composable world than it did in a monolith world. So we still have the code, code still gets deployed. We use Vercel quite a bit for our hosting as well as CDN. And then assuming that we have a headless CMS. Now, what's different here is because it's a headless CMS or a headless commerce, we need certain functionality to be fulfilled, which it needs to do, because headless CMS's job is nothing other than giving you the content you need, when you need, how you need it. So what we are showing here is in this actual diagram of what we did, we supplement a lot of that functionality with Azure serverless functions. So serverless functions you could write in different platforms. So basically they give you the ability to trigger things, do things, process things. And the website user still gets everything they need, because we're still calling Google Analytics, we're calling a personalization platform, we're embedding forms. Some of you might have done search where it's JavaScript based, where the website at the end, the site which gets rendered on your machine itself is making calls to get the search results. And then in the background, a lot of stuff is happening, like when the form is filled, something goes somewhere else. Emails get triggered, and the triggers go into the customer and the clients ultimately. But this completely looks different to what we had before. Infrastructure-wise, it's pretty light, but it still can pack a punch, and it does a lot better than a monolith. And in this case, we're trying to show you a headless commerce. Again, this is an actual diagram of the customer. We moved away from monolith into more of a composable. So we still have a headless CMS, we still have a headless commerce, but all of them are talking to each other either via API, and where there's two API endpoints. So if you can see headless commerce and headless CMS, both of them have APIs, but you need something to marry them together. So that's where we're using serverless functions to interact between the different systems. And then at the end of the day, again, we push it to Vercel. It can be consumed in different ways. So you can consume it with mobile POS systems. And then once it gets rendered on the end customers and clients browser, we are talking to Google Analytics or whatever your forms or search provider or personalization provider is. So the architecture looks a little bit different. We are achieving probably the same, if not better, but the way you do it is a little bit different. So if we go to the next slide, the important part here is you need to look at it more from a business driven architecture. What it means by that is when you're trying to get into a composable world, you're not going to go in there and say, oh, you know what, let's pull out Sitecore XP and then put something in. Let's pull out Sitecore Commerce and put something else in. That is not the mentality you need to have. What you should look at is, all right, so now we've decided that we want to go composable. What does that mean really? So let's go back and look at what kind of issues are we having. So does our product department, is everything seamless for them to get product updated on the website, our marketing department. So you're basically talking to everyone who's involved with either your mobile app, website, whatever the content you're trying to push to whichever channel, and figure out what exactly are the issues. And that's what we kind of do in our road mapping sessions, which are agnostic of technology. We're not looking at technology at this moment in time. We look at what the problems are across the whole organization and figure out, all right, to fulfill these problems, what do we have? And then go from there. So you're always looking from a business perspective and not from a technology perspective.
Yeah, if we take a look at typical Sitecore development life cycles, you should be very, very familiar. Typically, we'll go with some requirements, and then at some point later, we'll build out a UX wireframes, and then the front-end team, a design team, will build the visual designs of what the site will look like, and then we can start actually cutting that up and building out the HTML. Should be handed over to the back-end developers, and then way down the line, before go live, we'll start to go into content entry mode like crazy, right, to try and make the site live. And then somewhere way down the line, we'll in this mythical phase 2 where we'll start to do the personalization pieces and the marketing automation pieces and that kind of thing, if it happens. The composable development lifecycle can actually be shortened because we can do a lot of this work in parallel. The requirements gathering, as I actually just mentioned, those road mapping sessions and things like that are extremely important still. So take the time to set that up. And once we got the UX done, the visual design can actually start to happen fairly quickly, and then we can start to actually build that site straight away. The front-end team could start building it almost immediately against a live SaaS-based, cloud-based system, right? The content entry can actually also happen at the same time because it is a SaaS system. As long as you have your content models, the information architecture set up correctly, the content entry can happen immediately, which also is beneficial because the front-end team can actually now start to build against a live set of content rather than just lorem ipsum code. And then your backend developers can be working on those Azure functions and running those backend processes at the same time. There's no dependency on each of these teams typically. And then you just add more features and services when you need them. You don't have to preload them. You don't have to overthink these things as you used to. This approach actually does. Anyone that's worked with SXA will know that this is quite a similar approach to how you work with SXA, especially with the wireframing thing. You can do the wireframing to create the UX, and then the visual design can be layered on top of it. But at the same time, the content entry team can be going in and building up content just based on the wireframes itself. But it's a very rapid, very iterative, and a very, very agile process we found. And then I mentioned content modeling a second ago.
Yeah. Your screens are merged, Cameron, so I see two slides merged, one on top of another. All right, Yeah, so content modeling is a word which is like everyone and their mother is talking about, right? But it really doesn't mean anything different. So what, some of us have been doing Sitecore for 10, 13, God knows how many years. But as part of our Sitecore job, it is our job to look at requirements and then split it into data templates, visual templates, like how we store data, template inheritance, right? So that's actually the nature of our job, the way we architect things. And we do that by default. Content modeling is nothing but a fancy word for it. But the whole intent for content modeling in a composable world is basically you're trying to keep the content as channel agnostic as you can. What it means by that is if you have CSS classes or anything which you need for visual part for mobile app, visual part for not just visual, anything specific to a mobile app, anything specific to a website, for instance, the core data needs to be separated from that. So the way you would have your models inside of these headless CMSs, you try not to include those as much as possible until you need to. So you keep the data very, very reusable. And that's basically what content modeling in this world is. The next one, so visual editors, we talked about it a little bit. And it's kind of interesting, right? So like it might sound odd to you, but my favorite visual editor is still page editor. I call it page editor still because we change the names every so often. But if you look at our experience editor, it has everything we need. So we can customize it. It's fairly complicated. You could do quite a lot of custom actions. You could do quite a lot of things in it. Is it fast? No, I mean, it has its own advantages and disadvantages, but it is actually very, very good. You're not going to get that in the composable world, just because purely simple reason. In a very omni-channel, headless CMS perspective, the whole job of the CMS is purely to give you content. Content based on your request, content based on however you need it. So some people give it to you as XML or JSON, whatever that is. But when you're querying for content, the headless CMS's job is to store, give an ability for the content editors to add things, and for the developers to get it. Its job is not to give you a visual representation of the content, because technically it doesn't know how the content is going to be used. So that's the whole omni-channel perspective of it, is that the CMS, headless CMS, does not know how this content will ever get used. So it's hard for them to give you a visual editor. There are certain tools though out there. So like there's Builder.io, there's StackBit, there are external applications which you can buy subscription to, which link to your headless CMS and other systems and give you a visual editor, which is kind of cool. There's also Web Spotlight from Content by Kentico, which is integrated into the headless CMS. It does a pretty good job, but honestly, none of them compare to Experience Editor. So you shouldn't be expecting that if you're going the composable way.
Yeah, and I think Sitecore's new tool, front-end as a service tool, it's called Symphony. I mentioned it earlier. It's like the next generation Sitecore Horizon. Should be quite interesting, because it if it takes, especially if it takes all of that, all of that features from the Experience Editor, and some of those features from Horizon, although it wasn't complete, but that it was kind of getting there. That should be an interesting one if you can actually start to build those pages up in the way that we have been used to, right? So that, and especially if it can sit on top of other headless CMSs and bring all of that experience together as well. It's definitely a different way of getting used to, but there's workarounds, and we haven't had any big blocks as a result of it. But I think it is important to note that composable doesn't mean that it's actually composable in the pages like we've been used to. Typically, a lot of them will follow these like templated based approaches, but there are builders for systems available if that's of importance. So let's just jump ahead and talk about what it means to be a .NET developer in a composable world, because that's where most of us are coming from. We all will have these questions. Does that mean I'm no longer going to be redundant now? What am I going to be able to do in this world as a .NET developer? Because I keep hearing that composable sites are all written in JavaScript and React and Next.js, and I'm not a front-end developer, so what am I going to be doing? Can we even do anything in the .NET world with Jamstack? I think it's important to note that Jamstack doesn't mean composable necessarily, right? They're used quite synonymously, but they are two different things. Jamstack is the architectural approach to building the sites. Composable is the stack of the products that you use to build your solution. You can do one without the other. So I can build a composable site and not be Jamstack. I can just write it as purely as a .NET Core app. .NET Core, .NET can be an integral part of your stack and your solutions. I mean, it is for us. You saw in our earlier slides, we use a lot of Azure functions, and we write all of those in C#. And you could, in theory, write those in JavaScript as well, but we picked not to. It's the makeup of our teams. A lot of teams are already working this way in a multi-skilled kind of fashion, especially with the JSS that I mentioned earlier. There's a split between the front-end developers and the back-end developers, and writing the front-end code in React and then the back-end resolvers in C#. And I think it's also, in terms of moving away from being a very Sitecore kernel-based developers, I think we have to remember that we were agnostic developers before we became very specific vendor developers only, and actually being an agnostic technologist is going to open up your job prospects a lot more than just being a Sitecore developer. You'll have a lot more opportunity going forward as long as it's been being in this niche world. And you can obviously create the solutions I mentioned earlier as technology agnostic, but you can create the solutions in whatever language you choose. You're just working against REST APIs. So you can do it in JavaScript, .NET, Java, Ruby, PHP, whatever. It doesn't really matter. You can create actual Jamstack sites, so static generate sites using a .NET Core. There's a framework called Static, and the concepts of that will be quite similar for us going from the Sitecore world. You have the concepts of pipelines and modules, which are the equivalent of pipelines and processes in Sitecore world. So you put a document into a pipeline, it runs through a number of modules, and you get an HTML file out at the end of it. The only thing with static from our perspective is we had used it, and we don't like it so much because it statically generates everything, which works great as a proof of concept. And when you have 10 pages and 20 pages and 50 pages and even 200 pages, the build is pretty quick within a couple of minutes. But as soon as you hook up a CMS system to that, those 200 pages become 1,000 pages, become 10,000 pages, become 50,000 pages, right? Especially if you have products and stuff built onto that, and then the build goes through the roof. So we actually ended up switching to Next.js pretty early on. Next.js had the concept of static site generation, which will pre-build the site, or server-side rendering, which will just run the code per request, very much like how your traditional Sitecore sites run, or incremental static regeneration, where you can statically generate some pages and then the other pages will just be cached based on a per request basis. So a request comes in, it will build the page, it will cache it for however minutes you tell it to, and then each next request, every single request after that will just be served from the cache, and then the cache will expire and it goes through a cycle again. And then there's also easy build and hosting providers like Vercel and Netlify in the JavaScript based world, which we couldn't find in the .NET world. You have to do it in things like Azure and things like that, and handle all of that yourself. You can obviously also create just your own .NET Core application, and it will be the equivalent of server-side rendering. Just serve up each request at a time. If you needed to, you can layer up a CDN on top of that, and then add in some custom logic and some webhooks to actually clear the cache. But we've all been bitten by the caching validation issue in the past, even within the Sitecore space, as bit of that caching is.
Yeah, it's still merging on my wall, but I'll go in anyways. So, what does a .NET developer in a composable world mean to me? So, like Kamruz is saying, it's not like we're obsolete, right? We still do .NET. We love doing .NET. Just the composable and headless nature of these systems, there's a lot of back-end work. So imagine your commerce systems, anything where you're doing connections, pushing data, triggering things, webhooks, everything needs to be done. And this is done basically via serverless function. So wherever you write your serverless function, so there's two major platforms for it, right? So it's either Azure or AWS Lambda. In both cases, you could write them in C#, in .NET Core. And there's other options if you wanted to, but pretty much everything you need to do, you are able to do that in .NET, and most of the functions we write are on .NET based. So use anywhere where there's serverless functions needed, that's where the .NET developer comes into play, and you can do all of these hookups. And then
please.
go on.
There you go.
Yeah, so there's other places too, right? So like if you wanted just pure .NET, you could do it in Azure or AWS Lambda. But all of these guys, which you see, Vercel, Netlify, Cloudflare Workers, all of them give you the option to do it in other things too. Like you could write PowerShell functions, you could write node-based functions, so you could include them as part of your own application as well.
There you go. Sorry guys, there you go. There's my right. So, I wanted to call out the different page request life cycles. So, typically in the traditional kind of cycle life cycle, the request will come in. It may go through a WAF or a CDN, and that'll be then handed over to the Sitecore infrastructure, Sitecore servers, which will then process that request through its pipelines and processes. And you may call out to a number of custom databases to get additional data or additional backend services, or call out some custom applications to get data for that page rendering, as well as obviously the content from Sitecore itself. You would then run through each of the renderings, compose that page, build that page up, and then return the end HTML to the user. And parts of that page may be cached, but it still needs to go through its processing, and it will do this for each and every single request that comes in. With the Jamstack type approach, you're pre-building or you're using the incremental static generation, but you're essentially pre-building these HTML. So when the request comes in, you're just returning just the pure HTML, no processing, back to the user. You may need other data on that page to supplement it, at which point that's where your JavaScript kicks in to call the APIs and composable services, or maybe call out to your Azure serverless functions, which will in turn call out to these custom databases, return that to the page, and then your final page will be rendered using the JavaScript. We may be used to some or all of these concepts from doing bits and pieces with Sitecore, like search results and things, but that's the basics of it. Is you're just returning every single request to the page gets the same response. You're not going through separate pipelines and separate processes based on the user that's logged in. Or where the user is from. You're just returning pure HTML, which is why it's so quick compared to those traditional systems. And then closing up, say the only constant in life is change, and in IT it is guaranteed. It's never a case of if, but a case of when. Sitecore has been around for a long time in its current guise. Myself, Akshay, we're very much grown up with this core CMS concept. Sitecore's been recognizing that change is coming. It's been making smaller incremental changes with things like JSS and things like that. But the new generation of Sitecore is on the way now. We need to figure out. You need to find what your stack is going to be. You've been doing a lot of these concepts already all along, even in this hybrid kind of model. So now's the next step is to go to almost pure static HTML, and then supplement the actual functionality on the site using services. Focus heavily on the client and the project needs rather than what part of Sitecore will fit this. It's like, what does the client actually need in order to best suit their needs in this particular project? And obviously reach out to the community. You know, we're all going through this same kind of journey. We've gone through some of this journey, so you know, feel free to reach out to us as well, and you can pick our brains as always. That's it. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to jump on. We can try to answer those. And while that happens, I'll just call out that we have a DX Community Cafe, where we're trying to share a lot of knowledge around Composable DXP, grab and sort of fill the gap between marketing and the tech sessions. Feel free to join and share your knowledge and obviously build your network as well. So if anybody has any questions, yeah, please do ask.
Anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hey, hi, Kamruz and Akshay, Jiten this side. Thanks for this wonderful session. So I've been working on this DXP with Jamstack on 10.2. So I just want to understand that how do you consider the security while connecting with multiple applications? So because each application will have a different way of communication, right? So how do you consider the securities?
So it's going to depend a bit on how you build your applications, and so if you're using incremental static regeneration or static site generation, and you're just spinning out pure HTML, the end result is HTML. So there's all the customer's going to see is just HTML. They're not connecting to any backend systems at that point, right? The connections are made in your build system, so that's where your security layer would be. If you're connecting to them directly from the front end, because it's account information, for example, then you're going to have to layer in those SSO parts, single sign-on parts, and handle those in your intermediary system. So if you have an Azure function, that's what will be checking the authentication, and then obviously passing that on to the backend systems at that point.
Yep, that makes sense. Thanks, Kamruz.
Right. Any more questions from anyone? I guess we're good to wrap then.
There you go.
Thank you so much then, Cam and Akshay. Thank you for your time, and thanks everyone for attending. We'll be uploading a recording of this session shortly on our YouTube channel, and if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to Cam and Akshay. You can pretty much find them everywhere Sitecore related. So again, thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you, everybody.